what is this? And you see, one of them was a miner's lunchbox, just the top part of it, so I told them what they should look for, and they were all thrilled. It started getting on where I started looking more into the mining aspect of archaeology. Now, University of Nevada in Reno has a very good program that was under Don Hardesty for that, but it's limited to certain parts of the country. It's not in most places like Butte and most of Colorado. Most of the archaeology and mining sites is done by historians. Now, one of the things that you run into with that is you get very interesting descriptions on the site forms. Some of that comes down to where you have tailings listed when there's absolutely no mill nearby. They mined up the tailings pile in the chamber. And as we all know here, unless you actually do an assay report on the dump, you don't know what it really is. It could just be low-grade ore that was stockpiled, especially more remote sites. So this presentation I'm going to give you here was originally a 10-minute one that went to the Colorado Council of Professional Archaeologists last spring. And just to try to get some of this onto the same page, because we just get multiples of the same thing. So to start with, there's one term that I'm going to go over with you guys, and that is resultant, because I'll be bringing this up later on in the program. The technical definition. A resultant is the simplest equivalent of a system of a force system. Such a force may be coplanar or non-coplanar. Basically, as far as it means headframe design, it's 1/2 the angle made by the rope from the hoist over the shove wheel down the shaft. That's important when you get to headframe design itself. So that's the technical part. There will be a short quiz afterwards. So many of the things that we are familiar with here in Butte, and I'm buying time for them to get the chairs in, so I'm going to grab one, is we all have seen Muriel Wool's book, Montana Baker. She wrote one for Colorado, one that covers California. And one of the things that she did was she did a lot of what we call the oral histories at the time. And her artwork is, actually all of her artwork, we've only seen in black and white, it's all actually beautiful watercolors, but they're not published, they're all sitting in the library in Denver, so. Okay. Now, everybody hear me okay? No.
No.
Okay.
Could you film him?
Could I what? I lost him. Okay.
Okay, so one of the things that you get quite often is people talk about shaft houses. Now,
Good.
the shaft house used to be very common all over the West. It basically allows you to enclose your entire operation in one building so that you can save on heating costs and keep an eye on your miners. Typical shaft house will have your power plant, hoist, compressor if you're using it, and your head frame, and probably your, in this case, you have a chute for water from a bucket hoist and an ore bin for your product. Now, in Colorado, the Colorado history, we call it the Purple Pig. It's about a 3-inch book that gives you all the context for the mining sites, prehistoric sites, historic sites. It's a monster book. It has 154 shaft houses and only 131 head frames. Now, I'm pretty sure the first thing I thought when I saw that was there should be an equal number, if not more, head frames than shaft houses. For that, we'll see a picture of this later on. This was the shaft house of the National Bell Mine in Red Mountain, Colorado in the 1940s. Most of the rest of it looks the same. So, once again, interior of a shaft house. This one is set up for bucket hoisting, like I said, very small. Trouble is, it doesn't allow for good ventilation. And if it catches fire, anybody that's down the hole is in trouble. A number of people been killed. So, height. Most of these old, early mining sites don't have very tall head frames. Head frame's height is affected by the types of hoisting you're using, whether you're using cars or skips, whether you're using pretty much what type of hoist and how you're handling it. If you need to have tall ore bins to get it into a railroad car, or if you just need to transport it somewhere else, you're using a conveyor belt, you don't need very tall head frames. So the older mines, especially small mining sites, you have 15, 20-foot tall head frames. The Matchless mine in Leadville, very famous mine, has a head frame that would fit inside most Butte hoist houses, with room left over for a lot of other stuff. So the basic thing on most head frames around here, the length of the cage strip, or the cage with the skip, the rope clamp in the clevis, and overwinding clearance, and then how much room do you need for your skip dumps if you're using them. That's what basically dictates the height of the head frame. As we know here, they range from anywhere from the 50-foot range to 150 to 200 feet. So, early head frames were basically just frameworks to hold the sheave bearings on. This is the combination shaft in Virginia City. It's mostly as you can see, it's a masonry structure with a very short head frame on it. This was originally completely enclosed, but typical of mid-19th century sites, we have a Cornish pump, we have a main hoist and the middle two sheave wheels, and then we have an auxiliary. So there would have been 3 hoists at this site. Now this is still there. Amazingly, it's fairly well intact. The state of Nevada just closed up the shaft, put a back cage over it, because apparently lots of bats like to be in that one. But this is one of the oddballs. As we get into Montana, things change a bit as we get further on. You know, this is expensive. Most mine sites are never meant to last more than 10 to 15 years, so you can't afford to put up a monster masonry structure at this time period without spending more money than you've got coming in. So basically, as we know, from the top down, you have the steel arch or crown of the head frame, the next to the sheave wheels, sheave bearings, then you've got your front legs and back legs, and your guides. Different kinds of sheave wheels, and this is from Heron Farnham. This was published in the 1930s, and these were engineers for Anaconda here in Butte. Bicycle spoke, which is very common in European head frames. Cast iron with a split hub, cast iron 2-piece. This is what's up on the diamond right now, 2-piece cast iron. And then the modern steel sheave wheels. This also gives you an idea of what time frame you're looking at, because cast iron usually goes a little bit older, and also means that these are the things you can break down, the things you can haul on a horse. You know, when you get into the larger ones, it's just not easy to transport without a modern transportation facility. So if you get into a backwoods site, you're more likely to see things that can be broken down into burro or mule loads. Basically, different kinds of journal mounts. The post mount, which is very common on wooden head frames. Girder mounts, in this case from a Gillette Herzog diaphragm mount, but it's basically a non-adjustable girder mount bearing, and then the adjustable girder mounts, which are what we have today. Now this is basically the drawings of the ones that were on the Black Rock, the Belmont, the Badger, taken right out of the Anaconda Company books of the time period. They're adjustable, so you don't have to reset the entire sheave if things get out of alignment. You just move your bolts. That's what you'll find today for the most part. These older styles are not quite so common. They need a lot more effort if things get out of alignment. All right, so head frame classes. This is where we got into some fun. Is Eric Twitty in his 2002 book, Riches to Rust, only had sinking class head frames and production class head frames. So that kind of oversimplifies the system too much. It doesn't give you any idea of what actually was going on at the site, because, oh, it's a sinking class, they were just driving a shaft, they weren't doing much. I argued for this is prospecting class, you know, the things that are just expedient. I need something to hoist a bucket, very simple. Usually on very small prospects you get a windlass, so there's really no head frame as such. Development small mines. This is most of what you find in the western United States through Colorado and the backwoods of Montana. Small production, they could be for just developing things before you put a bigger surface plant on, or it could be as far as it's going to go because there's really no need for anything more. You don't spend money on something you don't need, as we all know. And then for production, and this is where it got kind of confusing, is I kind of arbitrarily put light production 100 to 200 tons per day, moderate 200 to 1,000, and heavy over 1,000. And this is because this varies on the kind of product you're mining for. If you're in a gold mine, 100 tons a day is a pretty good amount, especially if you've got to haul it out on burros. You know, you're only getting 30 or 40 tons a day out. So 100 tons is a huge amount for a gold mine, but wouldn't even be thought of here in, you know, even the smallest mine in Butte would be above that level. And then, of course, the next class of head frame is a maintenance class. These are never intended to hoist or, they're only intended to keep the shaft in repair. And display head frames. Now, we have one in Butte, the Silversmith over at Lexington Gardens. This is for out of context. Now, in the archaeological world, everything's about context. An artifact means nothing if it's been removed from where it's supposed to be. So when you move something as large, an artifact as large as a head frame, it's not over its original mine site. And archaeological value is no longer present unless it has been properly documented. However, it doesn't detract from the landscape value or the historic value of that artifact. So when the Cripple Creek mines in Victor expanded their pit and were going to take out the Crescent head frame, the mining company paid for it to be dismantled and re-erected in the town park. It was missing major components, and they lost a shiv wheel along the way, and it doesn't look right. When you glance at it, it's like, oh, it's a head frame, but it just doesn't look quite right. And then when you look at it closer, you see that it's missing quite a few parts of it. And that's one of the problems where you have display head frames, is sometimes they don't get put quite back together the way they were taken down. All right, so two major, now I'm not going to talk about concrete head frames because most of them are not more than 50 years old. So we're going to the 50-year-older rule for historic significance. Wood head frames, rough, milled or repurposed timber with spikes, bolts. There's another variant with milled timber, spikes, and bolts. Third variant that has those milled timbers with tie rod spikes and bolts. We'll see some of these. And a final one that I do not know if they ever built one, but it was proposed to use laminated wood components. This was towards the beginning of the 20th century. And use the laminated wood that was cheaper than steel, but just as strong at the time. Whether they did it, I don't know. I don't believe any was ever built in Butte here. Okay, metal head frames. Steel and very occasionally cast iron. You've got built-up components, rolled components, a mixture, or repurposed. Now, shown here, this is the Oakwood shaft. This was built in 1870 for the Lehigh Valley Coal Company, and this was the first steel head frame in the United States. It does not have a back brace. It's basically a tower-type four-poster, similar to the Joplin, but they're hoisting coal in balance, so they didn't have vibration problems. The weight of the structure meant that it wasn't going to overturn easily. It was actually made out of cast iron channel bars that were placed together. It took me forever to find a picture of this one because this was gone fairly soon and forgotten. So we'll start off with our different types of head frames. And like I said, this is the introduction. We'll go to the local stuff. Tripod, very portable. You see these in lots of pictures of Buttes, especially on small leases. You can basically fold it up and take it wherever, mostly for bucket hoisting. You'd have a horse swim, and then, or a whip. You could use a whip also. Rope would go up, and the shiv wheel would be at the top, and then just for shallow bucket hoisting. Usually these would be erected once your shaft reached 60 feet or more in length. But 60 feet or under, you can usually use a windlass with better efficiency than a horse. This one is out of Arizona. Now this one here is one that some of you have probably not heard of. This was the Nunchuck head frame in Butte. This came out of Heron Farnham. This is a drawing because the only picture I had was in such bad shape that it just was fuzzy. I couldn't get a really good scan of it, so. This was originally made of unmilled timber, so this is basically raw tree trunks bolted together to form this. This was around 1903. It was set up for cage hoisting here in town. I have not been able to find the location, and I was going through the Sanborn maps just the other day, seeing if I could find exactly where this is. So I haven't, but this was, once again, out of Heron Farnham, as a good example of an early tripod head frame that had been adapted. Now, one thing to remember is look at the angle of these and just the general design, because you're going to see this later. Now, once more this is the Parnell head frame in the pit. This is a tripod head frame. We've got the two front legs and then the main structure being that carries the shiv wheel. Even though this was a maintenance class, this is about the only steel tripod I've seen. Now you notice the similarity to the Nunchuck head frame, just different materials. Easy to erect, easy to put up, and easy to move when you had to. Okay, two posts, common. Your uprights are at 90 degrees. You may have two or more shiv wheels, usually at least one. Your back brace. Now this is where the resultant comes in. When if you have an incline shaft, you may not need a back brace. But since very few systems are luxurious enough to be able to balance everything out on just two upright posts, the back brace is put in so that the angle of the force of the hoist will fall in between the two legs. Worst case scenario will fall on the plane of the back brace bend and prevent overturning. Those are probably the most common type. You find them for bucket hoist, and they're used all over Colorado. Any carpenter could make one. Here's one of the variants of a two-post. This is out of Goldfield, Nevada. Now you can see what the problem is here. You've got your basic two-post head frame design, but they're hoisting so much that it's having stability problems. They've got braces on the sides. They've got guy wires. This one has tie rods in it, so this would have been early 20th century. And that's one of the problems with the two-post. It's not a very stable design. You can get to rocking, the more vibration you get, you can actually just shake it apart, which is why they went out of fashion. Something we never saw in Montana, the droplet type. Usually used on prospecting, mostly out of Missouri. It's usually the hoist is set up so close that the result is within the footprint of the structure. Once again, I've never seen one out west, but it's in manuals and you might occasionally encounter it. Okay, 4, 6, and 8 post. 4-post head frames now, Mr. Twitty had them as separate types of head frames, but they're really, from an engineering standpoint, only the 4 outer posts and their bracing takes the wind pressure, so interior posts are redundant. These have a sill beam, foundation, usually fairly wide, and they can be of any height necessary. This has been modeled after the National Bell. This was the one that the shaft house I showed you in the beginning. This is what's inside it. And here, the hoist is close enough, the resultant falls right about here. And it's still standing, in fairly decent condition. In Montana, this is down by Vipond. Some of you have probably seen this one. I don't know if it's still standing or not. Here, same thing is the outer posts are the structural components. The interior posts are mostly redundant. This will probably be gone in a few years because with no maintenance, wooden head frame that usually has a 10 to 15-year lifespan. Okay, California type, or South Africa. This is the one where 2 parts of the world developed the same thing for the same reason. Here we notice that all 4 legs of the main structure are equally inclined to each other. This gives stability in all 4 directions. These are usually your heaviest production wooden head frames, or this design type. And you also find a lot of metal head frames, like the Mizpah in Nevada, and a number in the South African goldfields. Once again, it's just a modification of the 4-post for better stability. This one here is the German head frame. Now, Mr. Binkley, who we'll talk about in the section on Butte, said this was the best type of head frame to build out of steel in the early 20th century. You didn't have to use very many materials. All of the main structural components are along the back brace bent. The resultant line falls within this, and the front legs are only to keep the thing anchored down. Now, the Germans built this in the mid-1870s. The overlay shaft is Germany's oldest standing steel head frame from 1876, and it's basically this design. Very light front legs and very massive back brace. Once again, I don't believe any in Butte have been built on this design. But this is where we get into the important thing. Montana type head frame. This is where in the current books, a lot of what we see on the hill here has been called a Montana type head frame by folks that never grew up here and never read the engineering manuals. What we have is a different type here at Conway. But the Montana type head frame developed here in Butte. If you find one of these anywhere in the country, somebody from Butte probably built it. It's easy, it's an easy one. Once again, from the front it looks like a 2-poster, but when you get to the side you'll notice that the main legs are inclined forward towards the shaft. The legs in front of the shaft are inclined backwards. The A-post is towards the hoist, the B-post is away from the hoist. And the back brace is standard. This is based on, this particular drawing is based on the Mountain Con head frame, the wooden head frame. And in this case, the resultant would have fallen right in between the 2 legs. It had a longer, the distance was longer here because of where the hoist was placed. Now, Binkley thought that this was influenced by the German design, but I believe that this was not influenced by the German design whatsoever. The earliest records I can find state that the Montana type head frame was put together by one of the carpenters at the mines. No names. Haven't found that yet, so anybody that knows the name, let me know, because I'd like to know if anybody really knows the designer. What I think happened was they were trying to find a way to save timber from a 4-post head frame. And the guy had the brilliant idea is if he made this into basically a triangle, he could save all the extra bracing and wood that would have to go up to make a traditional 4-post head frame. Now, these were supposedly unstable. You notice how wide they are across the front. That's not the case. They're fairly stable. The largest hoists of the 19th century were used with Montana type head frames. Now, stability problems may or may not have existed, but once again, like this South African and California type, it didn't take much to make the front profile an A-frame to give you better side-to-side stability. As you can see here, it wasn't very much of a modification at all. Just tilt the front two timbers in and the back brace plane in, and you still have the same design, but much better stability. And I threw this picture in just as, you know, Berkeley head frame, which I believe came off the Rares and may have come off the Higher even before then. And you can see the original short cage hoisting head frame. The taller ones were usually used with skip hoisting. A-type, here's a familiar one. This is what basically most of everything in Butte is an A-type head frame. It looks kind of like the letter A from the front, and that's mostly because of the design of the times. Usually 30 to 40 feet across, 40 to 60 feet long, fairly small footprint. And this is the kind that was the most efficient and easiest to build for most of the western United States. Most steel head frames in the western U.S. are some variant of this pattern. And originally I showed all the archaeologists in Colorado the diamond. We'll see this again later. Okay, so preservation. This is a big one, especially in Butte. You can't save everything, unfortunately, because there's not enough money. People don't want to spend a lot of money on things that they don't think are worth things to them, especially when you're going after tax money. In Colorado, the standard thing, even for Anasazi sites, is protect and avoid. An oil company will spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to route a pipeline around an archaeological site rather than having to pay for mitigation to go through it. Unfortunately, the highway department's the same thing. They'll move the highway a few feet so they don't have to deal with the archaeological site. This is an example that's just south of Slide, Colorado. The highway, the edge of the highway is right about there. They moved the highway over a few feet so they didn't have to deal with this. And this has been backfilled. It's complete. There's a hoist in the small house, a very tiny one. And right now I can fit my hand through the joints here. This thing is going to fall over in another year or two. It's not going to be here in 10 years. I'll guarantee that. And it's not that old. And that's one of the problems when you get into the preservation is, especially with wooden head frames, it requires a lot of maintenance. The steel ones are a little bit easier, but even they aren't completely immune for problems. This is the last complete Montana head frame that I know of. This is at the William Beck Shaft in Eureka, Utah. Once again, obviously, Butte influenced them. There were several of these. This was originally closed in a shaft house. It's about 60 feet tall. There were several of these head frames there. The Centennial Eureka is another standing one, but it has actually had all of the cap timbers collapse. Now, part of the design that I say that shows how stable it is that even though the middle of the Centennial Eureka is collapsed, both sides are still standing, and it has not had any effort done to preserve it. Now, similar to Butte, Eureka started preserving its head frames. They have a number of them in town, and as you can see, they've done a lot of reclamation there also. One of the problems was that the William Beck is that the person that was contracted by the state of Utah to do the mitigation work decided that the best thing to do was to knock down the ore bins and the skip guys and push them into the shaft and set them on fire. Apparently it took the Eureka Fire Department 2 weeks to put it out. After that, the city of Eureka got very upset. And like Butte, Tonopah, and a few other cities, this is the symbol of their town. This is important to a mining culture, is the symbol. You know, a tunnel doesn't look very exciting, but a head frame can be very dramatic. And so they like to preserve this. As you can see, there's a lot of new timber in this head frame. But they're doing their best to preserve it and keep it from falling down now. And then we have the other line. This is in Park City, Utah. This happened last August. Now, when you're very, very, very wealthy, you can afford to drink mine water. In Park City, the drainage tunnel for this mine is their municipal water source.
What?
The water company owned the mine, and they kept the shaft open in order, apparently for ventilation. They built a multi-million hotel, and they decided, oh, well, we're not going to completely take out the mining structure. This is the Daily West shaft. We're going to leave it as a quaint reminder of what our heritage is in Park City. But they didn't do any collar maintenance. So this had a collar collapse, and as you can see, it took the head frame down quite nicely. I think it's still that way. They're trying to decide what to do with it. Unfortunately, nobody knows, since we're a long time from when this was standard building practice, they don't really know how to disassemble this and reassemble it somewhere else. There's a little bit of damage here, but for the most part, you can see how strong these structures are. It's fairly well intact. The other problem, that, according to the park record, is they can't find a crane big enough that can lift the whole thing up at once. So this is one of the problems, is it's not just the structure above ground, it's also the underground features that you have to worry about in preservation. Sometimes it's easy to backfill them, sometimes there's not much you can do about it. So relocation may be necessary. Okay, so as we talked about, now this was a 10-minute presentation. At archaeological conferences, they usually don't give you much time, so I've taken a lot of time with you guys, which is good for this first part. This is the National Bell head frame nowadays. The shaft house has fallen down around it, but it's still standing. It'll stand for a number of years. There has been some mitigation work done by the state of Colorado. And that's one of the things. These are symbols of each town that has a underground mining culture. And they do need to be preserved, and we need to be mindful of the proper way to describe them in books. You know, just saying that it's riveted I-beams is not enough. You have to be able to tell what type it is, because when you know what type it is, you can get an idea of what influence that community had. If there's a Montana type head frame, Butte influenced that community. If it's a California or South African type, depending on which continent, you can pretty much guess where the people that developed it came from. And that's what's important, is remembering in a manner, because after a certain time, right now we're at the point where most of the folks who were around when these were built are passing away. And if we don't pass the knowledge on, pretty soon people won't really know what they really are for or what they did. I'm sure every one of you that has heard somebody talk about all the lovely derricks that you has had that happen there. And I'll go on that. I've heard that said a number of times, and that's what Mr. Twitty uses in his book. He calls these derricks. I work in the oil fields, it's no derrick. In fact, you rarely find a derrick anymore because they're all on portable drill rigs. They look just like something O'Keefe would be hauling around. A derrick is almost an obsolete structure, whereas a mine head frame is, most of the mine head frames here in Butte, if you moved them to a new mine, you could use them. You know, they're not an obsolete item. So that's the first part. So questions on this part here, and then we'll get to the local stuff. Anybody?
We mentioned a skip. What's a skip?
Oh, a skip is an enclosed, it's a modification of a bucket that runs on rails that basically it increases your hoisting capacity. Just think of a bucket on rails that you can use to hoist ore with, or coal. Early mines would usually use cage hoisting, where they just push the ore car into the cage and hoist the whole thing to the surface and then tram it out to wherever they needed it. Later on, it became more efficient to either dump the cars into skips, which, especially on incline shafts, were very common. They would just run on a pair of rails that were down the shaft. Later on, in the vertical mines, they just modified it. There was a couple of different kinds. The Kimberley type skip was developed in South Africa, and literally it just looked like a bucket with hinged on the bottom and then a catch mechanism on top. That was used at the Mountain Con, and I believe the Never Sweat at the original here. And then when it would basically come up, it'd hit a mechanism that would just dump it over. And then when it came back down, it would put it upright and lock everything back. Later on, the stuff that you see around here, the bottom dump skips, were a further refinement that were meant to make it even more efficient. Is that clear? Mm-hmm. Okay. Most small mines didn't use them, so they used buckets or cages. And a lot of times, especially with archaeological sites, you don't end up encountering skips very often. All right, now let me switch over to the other one. One of the problems that I had when I was going through this, and this was just to give every archaeologist in Colorado an idea of what they should be looking at, was every single piece of paper that I looked at on head frame design ended up back here in Butte. Every single one referenced stuff here in Butte, or people that worked here, or learned something here. And so the next part of this is a work in progress, and it's basically all the cullings that didn't make it to this first presentation. So I'll switch and we'll go from there. Okay, so one of the other things that happened when I was working happily at Salmon College. I was down in our theater department one day, and I look up on the wall for the latest group that's performing there. What do I see as a picture of the Diamond head frame? This band that had been booked in there had decided that that was going to be a really wonderful backdrop for their posters that they use all over the country. This was before the fences went up there, so it would have been, I don't know exactly when they took the photo, but they posed themselves up there, so it's plastered all over the western U.S. But people had no idea what it was, and the band members had no clue what it was either. So I started going on, and just like I said, little bits and pieces here and there. This one was, this photo was in the original presentation, because this is a very good photo of what most mine sites are going to look like. When people walk away after they've outlived their usefulness or the metal prices have fallen, sometimes everything's just left. So, early days in Butte, mostly gold and silver mining. This was a mine on South Montana Street. You know, you have, most early mines in Montana even used horse winds because it was easier than getting boiler power in. After you're deep enough where you can't use a windlass anymore. This one here, you can see there's no guides. It's a simple two-post head frame. This would have been bucket hoisted. And that's an easy way. If you don't see any guides on the head frame, it's probably just hoisting with a bucket. And the problem with that is it'll twist, it'll bang against the sides, and you can get, you know, if you're riding one, you can get hurt pretty easily. Most early day mines in Butte were very shallow. Once again, the gold and silver ore bodies, the treatment technology at the time did not allow unoxidized ore to be treated. Here's a photo of the Goldsmith mine up behind Walkerville. And here we've got everything. We've got a windlass, we've got a horse wind, we've got a very small outdoor head frame, and then we've got the enclosed Goldsmith. And I'm guessing that's cordwood to feed the boilers. Coal was very expensive and had to be imported here, as we know. That's why most of the forests are pretty young. But this pretty much covers all the main early hoisting mechanisms except for the whip, which was basically, with a whip, you just tie the hoisting rope to the horse and walk him straight out in the line. So your travel path is the depth of your shaft. Most people went with the wind because then the horse could walk in a circle and you wouldn't have to have as much space. But this is pretty typical. Shallow workings, numerous workings, and fairly you know, you've got primitive, you know, you don't have any real decent roads in this area, but you've got the railroad. So it covers all the transportation levels. Now, of course, the most famous of the early mines is the Bluebird. Now, all of us have seen the stone hoist foundations. This is actually a fairly remarkably intact site. There's been some collar collapse around it. However, most of the foundations are still there. But after the suicide of Van Zandt and the litigation that shut it down before the silver bust, it basically equipped a good chunk of the western United States. The machinery from the mill went all over the western U.S. to go to smaller mills. They split it up into smaller packets and sold it all over. So there's parts of the Bluebird are scattered all over, probably from Nevada all the way to the Canadian border.
Where was the blue?
The Bluebird is west of here. If you look from the truck stop kind of towards Big Butte, it's the big dump at the crown of the hill. It's still privately owned, so that's why it hasn't been bulldozed. So from the Bluebird, the hoist went to the Diamond, and the head frame went to the Blue Jay. So we know from that, with the 1900 picture of the Blue Jay head frame, there was a Montana type head frame, which meant, once again, local people designed it, built it. Blue Jay was on, I believe, 601 East Granite. It's, you know, was an inclined shaft. This one used bonneted skips for cages for a while. And there was not very many producing inclined shafts in Butte. Here we have the Nipper 1 and 2. The Nipper number 1 started off in 1897 as a new project. This was one of our friend Fritz Augustus Heinz's, probably an attempt to steal ore from somebody else. He built a lot of really first-class plants on ground that doesn't seem to have much reason to build a mine on. So I can almost guess that just about everything that he built was to steal something from somebody else. I remember my grandfather telling me even in the 1930s they were still breaking into workings that his people had driven that they had no idea were there. So, as you can see here, the Nipper number 1 is a two-post head frame, moderate size. The hoist is actually down here. But it's built up on stilts. Now, I've seen this in Colorado where there was 20 feet of cribbing to get a mine high enough, and that's because of the railroad beds. In order to get enough height to load the railroad cars, they had to elevate everything. The Nipper number 2 is a modified Montana type head frame, and it's probably about 80 to 90 feet tall for the same reason, just to get everything up high enough so that it'll gravity feed into the railroad cars. Now, these were all gone by about 1914, so these didn't have a very long lifespan. They were there, you know, the Nipper 2 was after 1900, but there's no mention of them on the 1914 maps. Unusually for these, they're all single drum hoists. So each one had a single drum hoist, and even though the head frames were set up for 2 compartments. And it was basically one compartment was a manway ventilation, the other one was the hoisting compartment. To the best of my knowledge, the Nipper 2 was simply oar hoisting. So now we get to the core and the rock island. Now, some of you may or may not have seen this older picture up here, but that's the Wild Bill mine there. It became a little bit larger in later years. The Cora here, this is the older Cora hoisting works from what I can tell. It looks like a Montana type head frame. The original Cora hoisting works was 200 feet east of the Cora shaft that most of us can remember here. So where the fan plenum used to be up there, 200 feet west of that is where the original Cora shaft was. In the background, this appears to be the Rock Island. Now the Rock Island was one of the last shafts of that area active. Butte had used it for ventilation in the 1980s. Once again, the Cora was leased to the Montana Ore Purchasing Company, and after a year or two, they put up a 115-foot tall wooden head frame. This was the first wooden head frame that Butte set up for skip hoisting, and as you can see, it had a very long chute in order to get everything into the bins, to keep everything from gumming up. Now, this hoist was pretty important because it ended up at the Belmont, along with the head frame. The hoist was 200 horsepower main hoist, good for 3,000 feet, made by Webster Camp and Lane, using 7.5 by half-inch rope. So, a pretty major, once again, when Fritz Augustus put up something to steel ore with, he went first class all the way. Now this is the Lexington that some of you, well, there's not very many of you that are old enough to remember the wooden Lexington head frame. But this was the head frame that stood until the early 1950s. Once again, Fritz Augustus had put it up after he got control of Lexington through one of his companies. It replaced a small 15 by 18 foot engine and a shorter head frame that burned in 1907. No, excuse me, burned in 1902. He got a hold of the mine, and by 1905 he put up a 100-foot wooden head frame and was trying to mine zinc out of it. Now, at that time period, zinc was a very problematical mineral. It was very difficult to treat, and that's something that will shape later on in Butte. Will change a lot of other sites. So. But this is what the Lexington looked like till the early 50s. You know, the mill was gone, that shaft house was gone, but a fairly modern timber mining structure. Now we're going to go to something that people have, for many ways, forgotten. Modoc and the Aztec. Now these are the names of the hoists. These are 3,000 horsepower hoists built by Union Iron Works of San Francisco. You can see how tall it is compared to the engineer. These are overhead double compound beam engines with a 26 by 72 inch high pressure and a 42 by 72 low pressure cylinder. Covered in teak wood, these are basically marine engines. Now, Union Iron Works, besides building a lot of hoists for Butte, also like to build battleships for both the US and Japan, and they build submarines for the Navy also. So basically you're looking at a battleship engine type here. These were installed at the Mountain Con and the Never Sweat. They were the biggest hoists built in the 19th century that were steam powered. They were good for about 3,000 feet using reels, 8-inch wide rope, which is slightly larger than most of them. Most rope was about 7-inch here, but the 8-inch was big. Now, this is important because Modoc and the Aztec led to what's probably the most iconic image of Butte. We've all seen this. Every single Butte book has this photograph in it. And why? Well, it's the dramatic nature. The Anaconda head frame, it doesn't dominate the system anymore. Earlier, when the Anaconda had a shaft house at 12 smokestacks, it was dominated this whole hill. But after the Anaconda was converted to a steel head frame and a 125-foot chimney was put up, it no longer was the most dominant site on the hill. The Never Sweat, however, at the brow of the hill, it's a great photograph. You've got the 7 boilers, which are 250 horsepower Berry boilers. In this case, one of them's not working, probably down for repairs. The other ones are going full bore. Now this photograph is taken from a very small shaft on the toe of the East Stewart mine dump. And I've seen photographs of it, and you can tell with the old fan housing, the old air shaft housing here. But this is probably one of the defining photographs of Butte. And it's only because of those monster hoists and the just setting that, you know, you get all the coal smoke belching out. And that makes a very good photograph. This has been colorized for postcards, and it's pretty important. It said that you could go to Ellis Island and say you were going to work at the mine with 7 stacks, and they'd send you right here. The Never Swept had the MODOK installed in it, and it was hoisting 8-ton skips. It was remodeled in 1900. It was originally closed in a shaft house, so this was all, some of us have seen those photographs where this is all enclosed. But after 1900, they took that down and leave the headframe exposed. Now, this basically stood until 1915. Mount Consolidated had the Aztec hoist, and it had 12 smokestacks for a while, but it was reduced after a while. It just wasn't ever as dramatic as the Never Swept. They were basically phased out in 1915 with 1,500 horsepower Nordberg hoists, and in the case of the Never Swept, the headframe was replaced, though the Mount Con left the original Montana type headframe. We'll come back to the steel headframe shortly. Then the Pittsmont. Now, some of us can remember when we could see the Pittsmont slag out there. Some folks remember East Butte, and you know, it was basically the Pittsmont company kind of defined East Butte. The Pittsmont had 4 working shafts. The number 1 was abandoned because it was hard to keep open with sand infill. This was the number 2 Pittsmont. And this was important because the Pittsmont company was experimental. The smelter had Baker smelting apparatus, which was a widely acknowledged failure to smelt copper. They started with a fairly small head frame. This arrow here to the top was the original head frame. And they were using cage hoisting. Later on, they increased it to 82 feet, as you see here, by another addition. And then when they went to skip hoisting, it went up to 94 feet. So they remodeled this head frame 3 times just by jacking it up and adding more timber underneath it to get the necessary height so they could move the ore. This was right in the smelter complex, so once again, it's not something you see a lot of because it doesn't make a very dramatic picture. It's pretty well surrounded by other buildings. This is one of the reasons that nowadays a lot of mines are using 4-post head frames. This was the only 4-post production head frame use in Butte in the 1930s. The steel ones that they use nowadays are done for the same reason. As long as you need height, all you have to do is add another sectional. You don't have to completely remodel it, which is one thing where the current A-type head frames as we have here in Butte, if you want to change the height, you have to do a major rebuild. With these, all you have to do is just keep adding and then add on to the back brace. Now, the other section of the Pittsmont number 3 was known for its rather unusual 2-post head frame. The cap on that head frame was 25 inches by 46 inches by 33 feet long. You can't find timber in the United States or anywhere in the world that's that big anymore. It did not have a lot of bracing in it, but it was notable just because of the actual massive numbers of timber, and that's expensive. And that's one of the reasons that steel head frames replaced wooden head frames after a while. The Anselmo was probably one of the most advanced wooden head frames in Butte. The original Anselmo was the original Anselmo claim was a 150-foot incline. There was a number of shafts on the claim, but the trifle shaft was what they used to develop the zinc mine. In 1923, this is a wooden version of a steel head frame, 70 feet tall and extremely heavily braced. Now you notice there's still a sill beam on this head frame. The Anselmo was put over a filled-in gulch. They were worried about stability problems, and it appears that whenever there was that, they would still put in a sill beam so you could level the entire structure just by using jacks. Now this stood until it was replaced by the Blackrock head frame in the mid-1930s. But early pictures of the Anselmo, this is the head frame you see, and it was a very, very well-designed head frame, and probably would still be standing today if they hadn't replaced it with the need for greater tonnage. Okay, now I'm going to go into something that's interesting. Like I said, once again, this is Cullings, so it's kind of rambling. These are things that I ran into when I was looking for the other presentation. The Hibernia is a forgotten mine in Butte. It was located west of the Orphan Girl and north of the Nettie. The head frame was 45 feet tall, with a wooden chimney over one compartment for ventilation. It was electrically powered and was a silver mine owned by the Davis Daly Company. The collar of the shaft was in place as recently as 2002, but it has since been bulldozed over. The foundations of the hoist house still remain. This is one of those where an engineering specialty has been kind of forgotten. This was something that was fairly important. The Hibernia was a 758-foot deep shaft. And the hoist on it was a 440 volt, 690 RPM, 112 horsepower Otama, second reduction, single drum hoist. 48 inch diameter drum and used 7/8 inch hoisting rope, which is pretty small. Most of the mines here were 1.5 inches, 1.25 inches or larger. Now it had a 10-tooth pinion and it was modified for balanced hoisting. And that's something that you didn't see very much of. The mining company here, the Pittman Silver Act in the mid-teens made silver worth mining again. Now, up until that time, the Lexington had been the only mine that continued as a silver mine, mostly through leasers, along with the Silver King. There was very little silver production because it just wasn't worth anything. The mine in Colorado at the same time period was mining ore that had 90 ounces of silver per ton, but they were mining the ore for the lead content. The lead was actually worth more in the smelter than the silver was. So, you know, silver, even really rich silver strikes were pretty much ignored. Now, at the Hibernia, you know, it wasn't a very deep mine, but they were having trouble with the engine. It was taking 125 horsepower to hoist the cage. They were hoisting a single double-deck cage with 1,100-pound cars on it. And it was slow, so once again, you're over the horsepower rating of the motor, so you're going to damage your motor eventually. It's slowing things down, and they decided that they wanted to get 400 feet per second, or feet per minute rope speed, and they decided to do some partial counterbalancing. Now, the partial counterbalancing showed that they needed 77 horsepower to lower, and they were still at about 125 to hoist. So they modified the hoist drum. They put 2 sets of ropes on it, put a counterbalance in the second compartment, and then with the concrete, they tried out. You just cut down the ventilation compartment, very small amount. And what they did was, by basically using a single drum hoist, they were able to equalize the power of 102 horsepower both ways. And by putting one side of the drum, they put a flange down the middle and increased the diameter of 6 inches on the diameter of the drum, and used a shove wheel 6 inches smaller on the ventilation compartment side of the head frame. And this little hoist, at that point, did more than they expected. They were able to obtain 700 feet per minute rope speed with a 25-tooth pinion, which was a gear hoist. And in the first 3 months of 1922, they hoisted 5,700 tons of ore with 86,000 ounces of silver and over 207 ounces of gold. It was worth it. They were able to increase shift, they were able to hoist over 95 tons of ore. And that's why, you know, the Hibernia hoist, I do not know, I've heard that it's the one that's at the Orphan Girl. I have not, the chippy hoist, I have not been able to check on it. So that's something you guys can all do next time you go to the mine museum to see if it is a geared drum hoist. Every time I come up, it's winter time, so I don't get to go up there. So I do not know if that is the Hibernia hoist or not. But the Hibernia hoist was a very special hoist. Okay, so steel head frames. Now we get into what we're most of you familiar with. They were installed in Butte from 1897 to 1988. Contractors are Gillette Herzog, Milwaukee Bridge, Bowman Seaver Morgan, Jones and Company, American Bridge, and Wisconsin Bridge and Iron. The first steel head frame was the St. Lawrence. This was installed by Bowman Seaver Morgan in 1897. And this is where things get a little confusing for a lot of folks. There were 2 head frames being constructed simultaneously. The state of Montana mine inspector puts this as the first one completed, so we're going to go with this one, though Tuscaloosa could be almost the same. Now, you'll notice when we talked about the tripod head frames, you notice the very stiff and angled tripod front here. This is basically, even though it's an A-type head frame, this is basically just a modification of the tripod head frames that we saw at the Nunsuch and what later became the Parnell. It's that design that's just been slightly more strengthened. Now, the St. Lawrence was made out of rolled steel components, and it was designed to hoist from a depth of 5,000 feet. Supposedly there were some vibration problems in it. It had a 2,500 horsepower Union Ironworks hoist. Now, the thing that a lot of people don't know is it was modified for a chippy, but it was not on the main head frame. You can see the chippy shove wheel here. There was a separate head frame that held that shove wheel for the chippy compartment. This is a basic layout of the St. Lawrence mine yard. Unlike most modern head frames, you'll notice that the back brace are very close together. So we have a triangle that the apex would be probably right about at the front of the hoisting rails. This is approximate here. These ones are engineered from engineering drawings from Seaver, Oregon. So this is basically what the outline would look like if we'd been documenting it today, if it still existed. So the side braces would come outwards, so from the top it looked like a large triangle. And that's where the St. Lawrence was a very unique head frame. It remained in place until the mine was dismantled in the 50s, and Seaver, Oregon was exceptionally proud of this design because it featured in their catalogs for many, many years. Once again, colorized postcards showing, this being a north-facing head frame, it's once again not quite as dramatic as a lot of the south-facing head frames, but nice compact mine yard. But once again, we see that, here you can see the back brace, how close together the vent was, and then the fairly wide A-frame, but it comes to a point right under the shift wheels. Now, the second one, officially, is the West Calusa. Now, these were being built simultaneously. Boston and Montana and Anaconda were both kind of trying to be the first. And this one you can see has a lot of resemblance to that head frame that we showed you, the combination shaft, down in Virginia City, Nevada. Unlike the St. Lawrence, which is only set up for 2 shift wheels, this is set up, you could almost put 4 on here. The main hoist was fairly low. This shows an English tradition. It's enclosed in a shaft house. And then the chippy shiv is slightly higher. Now, they were using this to sink the shaft while the main hoist was doing most of the hoisting. According to the Sanborn maps, the main hoist was only 1,000 horsepower, whereas the auxiliary hoist was 1,500 horsepower. So that's because they have to hoist out of balance with the chippy. Now, this was probably finished within a few days or weeks of the St. Lawrence, so these were going on simultaneously. This was a 2-post head frame, and you notice there's only a little bit of bracing in between the back brace. This also supposedly suffered from vibration issues. Unlike the St. Lawrence, which can be adapted to skip hoisting, this was a dead-end design. This was only for cage hoisting. The shaft on this mine, is, for those of you that would know, was approximately 5 feet by 9 feet cages. They hoisted 2 ore cars, but they were next to each other on a single deck cage. The advantage is you could also hoist your horses. And apparently at the end of the shift, the horses would tell everybody when it was time to go off shift because they get on the work. They go away to the cage, wait for their time to go up. And so that made for better health for the livestock, and it also, for those of you that have seen the pictures of them trussing a horse to lower it down a smaller shaft, meant there was a lot less headache if you could just lead the horse and the mule onto the cage and hoist them when they were sick or they needed a vet. Now, once again, this stayed till the end of when the mine was dismantled, but was not ever adaptable to skip hoisting. The third head frame was the Anaconda. This was the first built by Gillette Herzog, and once again, we see the transitional design here. You notice that there's a lot of squared off components on it. Very much looks like an old style capital A. The Anaconda was 58 feet tall and was designed slightly heavier to compensate for the problems they found in the other head frames. It was also basically a steel version of what a wooden head frame would be. You notice the side bracing is very simple. And this is a fairly typical for the time period. Gillette Herzog was just starting to get into it. Seaver, Oregon was a brand new engineering company in 1896. Gillette Herzog was mainly building bridges. There hadn't been very many steel head frames built. Eventually, the Anaconda was adapted for skips. It hoisted 8-ton skips. Now, the skip bins are below the collar of the shaft, so this is why the short head frame didn't make a difference on the Anaconda. The Anaconda, even when it had a shaft house, had a 40-foot level. And a 40-foot level, just to forestall a question, roughly 40 feet under the collar, they drive it out of the mountain so that you could feed the railroad bins. And that's what, if you look at older pictures of the Anaconda, you'll see there were railroad bins that are level down from the Anaconda. So they had a 40-foot bin, so they could dump below ground surface and then just tram it out to the railroad that way. So this meant that instead of this head frame having to be remodeled or abandoned, they were able to use it with skips right up until it was no longer necessary. Now, East Stewart. probably up into the 1920s. I have not been able to determine when it was dismantled. Pictures up to after 1915 show it present. One of the tragedies of this mine is that after the mine inspector required multiple openings and ventilation in different mines, Clark decided to reopen it for a ventilation shaft for the West Stewart. Now when they tried it, they found that the shaft was squeezed closed, they couldn't get the gauge past the 900-foot level. So they were retimbering and they were excavating, and Steve Hartnett, on January 6th of 1908, fell from 900 foot to the bulkhead on the 1200 foot. It took rescue crews relays of about a week to get to the body by retimbering the shaft as they went. And that's about the last thing, aside from a fire that happened in the fan housing in 1960, there's not much other record of what happened to the East Stewart. Okay, I'm going to skip the amalgamated pattern here. We're going to go to the Mountain View and the Leonard. These were designed by a guy by the name of George Binkley, and you'll see resemblances to more common head frames. This is the Leonard, mostly distinguishable by this elevated trestle. Other than that, it's hard to tell the two apart, except for some designs on the Leonard. The Leonard had a sill plate because there were subsidence at the shaft. So this one was the only steel head frame that had a sill plate tied into the design of the head frame. But it's basically, it's somewhat squared off. They're 94 feet tall. And they were bought by the Boston, Montana at the same time, and they were adaptable to skip hoisting, but they were both cage hoisting originally. The Mountain View didn't transition over to skip hoisting until about 1912. But these stood. The Leonard No. 1 and the Mountain View stood for many years, and after the Leonard No. 2 was built, this just became basically a chippy shaft for the Leonard, but also with lower waste rock for filling in the stopes. This is the Mountain View. Now you notice, I'll go back, you notice that the ore houses over the bins are pretty much the same along with the hoist houses. I'm pretty sure, except for minor differences, they came off the same set of plans. This is from the mine inspector's book. And like I said, you've got a fully enclosed shaft collar. Later on, this part of the building would be demolished so that you can get better ventilation. The hoist, flat cable, is very close to the head frame. And that's one of the things that, when you have to put your hoist close to the head frame, you almost have to have a flat cable hoist because of the angle to wind the rope. So that's why the Emma continued with a steam hoist right until the 1940s that was flat rope. There was no room to get it far enough away. Nowadays, they've got mechanical guides to guide the rope onto your reel, but at the time, you had a mechanical advantage from a flat rope that you could only get from a conical drum, which I don't believe any conical drums were built in Butte. And you could put it right up against the head frame. And here's a later picture where you can see that portion of the poorhouse was dismantled. This was a bicycle spoke post mount sheds. These were built by the Milwaukee Bridge Company. Now this is another one where it's kind of confusing because most of these bridge companies were combined later on. Okay, so common pattern, the amalgamated. Now this is what we see through most of the head frames here in town, is the amalgamated pattern. Post mount shiv bearings, and usually heavy in the early examples. They were designed heavy at the request of Anaconda, who had concerns about vibration problems. According to engineers at the time, they were approximately 100% over the amount of steel actually needed. This is why the diamond is probably the strongest head frame in Butte, is because it was right, if you'll pardon the expression, it was Russian engineered. I mean, it'd take a lot to damage that head frame. At least 9 examples were built. The trouble is with most mines, you have both full occupation and abandonment patterns. Head frames like this could move around several different times, so I'm not quite sure exactly how many actually were built of this design. But basically, once amalgamated, later on, Anaconda got this design, it was cookie cutter. There were some minor changes in the bracing, but it was pretty much send us another head frame when they called up and they'd get it. Now, this is the part that's interesting. In the 1898 contract for the 2 head frames, obviously the diamond and high arc pattern. But this is what it says on the design sheet. Anaconda ordered the head frames for the Never Sweat in the Iowa mine. They were designed in September of 1898. Now, the West Stewart was also designed in September of 1898, but it was actually erected before these. It was ordered after them, but erected before because it was pretty much a stock head frame. One of the big differences is you notice there's a lot more curves, heavy cover plates over the built-up materials, and why? Obviously, at this time, Anaconda was intending to put this headframe out the Never Sweat. They ordered it with skip hoisting because the Never Sweat was already hoisting the skips at the time. So something must have happened to the headframe at the diamond to cause this to be diverted. I haven't found out what yet. There's another challenge for you local folks to find out if anybody remembers why. But that's what the original 1898 contract has on it. The higher was identical, though it was only set up for cage hoisting until they eventually put the skip dump on it. And of course, you could modify with the chippy shiv. One of the tragedies I think about the diamond was, even though they did do an historic American engineering report on it, when they started to seal the shaft, they tore down all the buildings. It was a fairly complete mine yard, but they also took off most of the front of the headframe. And what happened to it, I don't know, but you know, it's in a state of partial dismantlement. It's a good thing that it didn't get all the way torn down, because this is a very important one. This is in almost every textbook on headframe design of the time period. The next amalgamated pattern headframe went up to the Parrot. Now, Parrot had a fire. It was originally equipped with a 4-post headframe in a shaft house. Now, in August of 1899, it burned. Now, nobody was killed, but the Parrot company all of a sudden didn't have a viable producing shaft. So, they ordered this one, and supposedly this one, the side bracing was designed by Nels Bovedal, who was an amalgamated engineer. Binkley claimed credit for this design, and since it bears resemblance to the Leonard, it was probably George Binkley, with some help from other folks, that designed this particular style headframe. So basically, this was an off-the-shelf purchase. They called up Gillette Herzog and said, we need a headframe and we need it fast. So they shipped this one in. They also shipped a 25 horsepower hoist from the Union Shaft in Virginia City. Now that hoist was built in 1877. It's probably the 3rd largest steam hoist in the 19th century. Somehow the computer appears to have a lag. So this is one of the ones that, Parrot is still a fairly intact mine yard. The Parrot company worked until 1910 when they were bought by Anaconda. They shut everything down, but the headframe remained until 1915 because the shareholders of the Parrot company started suing, saying they didn't get what was due them. So this basically remained until about 1915 when the headframe was removed and put on the Never Sweat. So eventually the Never Sweat got its steel headframe. One important thing here is the hoist house. Now, many folks, I've seen it many places where they only talk about 2 brick hoist house remaining in Butte, but there's actually 3. The Parrot hoist house is still there. Notice the ribbing on the side of it. Get this to move on. It's being slow for some reason. There we go. Parrot hoist house has still got the cutouts for the flat rope, even though they're bricked up. And you can still see the ribbing on the side of it. So this is the 3rd brick hoist house that's still remaining in Butte.
Where is this?
The Parrot, right by the Parrot shops over here, just down below the Kelly headframe. And so this was the ultimate version of the amalgamated pattern. This was the Leonard number 2. This was 141 feet tall. Gillette Herzog was bought by American Bridge in 1905. So after this time, Gillette Herzog, Milwaukee Bridge was all one company under American Bridge. This was the tallest headframe in the western United States for many years. It was basically a scale-up amalgamated pattern, and it was only designed for 300 feet depth, but it had vibration problems. Once they hit 2,800 feet, it started to vibrate. So this remained on. This was the blasting down of this headframe was another iconic picture of me, which I elected not to put in. So we'll run through them because, like I said, most of this is, like I said, Cummins. The Speculator. This was the one that went to the Sarsfield originally, 50 feet tall. Important here is we notice the design that Gillette Herzog was making to lighten it up. They took the cover plates off the amalgamated pattern, but kept some of the rounded corners. In 1905, a headframe identical to the Stewart and original replaced it, and it was moved over to the Sarsfield. The original shaft of the Speculator was a 350-foot incline, so this was, once again, stood until the 60s. Now, in 1902, William Clark, after the success of these Stewarts, ordered 2 identical headframes from Gillette Herzog and 2 identical hoists from Nordberg. That's the Stewart original. The West Stewart was put up first. When they got done with that, they moved the crew over to the original. which raised a new shaft in 1900 to replace the 1,500-foot long incline shaft. These are 127 feet tall. They're actually taller than the Badger, or the Belmont, or the Mountain Con. And they are, once again, here you don't have the heavy post mount shev bearings. You've got the girder mounts, and these are the type that you can modify if you needed more shev wheels on the top. The tramway was just a 94-foot version of the same design by Gillette Herzog with 3 on top. Blackrock, the first Blackrock in 1910, very simple, once again, same design for Gillette Herzog, but the 1915 Blackrock number 3, which is the one on the Anselmo today, it's 135 feet tall, originally designed for just 2 shev wheels, but it was modified to match the 3, so it looks very similar to the Con and the Belmont and the Badger. It was there until the 1930s. It's all made of all rolled steel components, whereas the older Blackrock was made up of built-up latticework components. So built up is what the latticework head frames are. The rolled steel are the I-beams. Elmore-Lou latticework. This one was modified because it had a hoist identical to Granite Mountain installed in 1915 or so. And they had to put the hoist 110 feet back, so they had to put another back brace leg on it. Made it a very unique head frame. Pittsmont number 4, forgotten head frame. This stood right behind the East Butte Fire Station on the top of the slide from the smelter. Don't know when, it probably was up into the early 50s. There was a collar collapse there. I don't know if it was still standing at that time or not. This was the deepest of the Pittsmont shafts. A very massive, you can see it's basically a wooden head frame that made it very heavy steel. Originally adapted for cage hoisting. I don't know if they converted it for skip hoisting or not. 1926, they decided to upgrade 3 main hoisting shafts of the Badger, Belmont, and Mountain Con. They basically, the Badger was used a steam hoist and a wooden head frame to sink the shaft, and then they just built the head frame over. They ordered 3 identical head frames from Wisconsin Bridge in iron. I have a feeling that they made them 125 feet tall to clear the old core rig head frame. You can see that the other ones, there's plenty of room on it, but this is the one where it's closest. It was probably cheaper to order 3 than just 1. And of course the Mountain Con, the 63-foot Montana type head frame stood until this was erected. The original hoist house here was found to be unstable for the new hoist. So in the Con, they had to move the hoist house to the top of the hill because stoping operations in this area made this very unstable for the heavy hoist that's up in the house right now. Okay, now this is the one that the most interesting thing happened on. Like I said, it was really hard to try to figure out how to do this because there's so much information that pops out that folks allude to or think about. But the Orphan Girl head frame, what we know was installed at the Colorado mine early 1909. The date of February 1st, 1909 was its completion date. The Webster Camp and Lane hoist from the Raris was moved to the Colorado for working. But where did it come from? We all know that it eventually moved to the Orphan Girl in the 1920s and is still there. Well, I took a look, and the Davis Daily Copper Corporation was originally a shell corporation by Fritz Augustus Heinz for basically laundering money. The outright trade publications of the time period said it was a stock fraud. It was just basically meant so he could use the money of investors for his own purposes. However, after he was bought out initially, they reorganized, and they were going to exploit the Hesperus Smokehouse and Mount Moriah's veins. Now, the Mount Moriah was prospected from the original with a crosscut from the 1800 foot. They didn't find much in that ground worth mining. The Smokehouse, as we know, is underneath the Acoma building, and the Hesperus was a little bit east of the current Colorado site. Well, I took a look at this because I was going to try to trace it because, you know, we can trace it back so far but not further. But this is an 1890s design. Gillette Herzog, you can see the crown of the arch as their distinctive design on it. Post-mount shev bearings, 70 feet in height, nothing particularly huge. This, of course, was the addition that was put on in the 30s of rolled steel with girder mount shev bearings. So I started looking back through the designs. And I found that I found a design for the basin and base state. Now this was the design in 1897. This was an extremely heavy 60-foot tall steel head frame that was supposed to go in the basin. It was supposed to withstand the breaking strain of 1.25 inch hoisting rope along the plane of the back brace. Now, the only hoist in the world that could have done that was sitting in Butte at the time. You know, but this was never built. By 1912, the same mine had this head frame listed as the basin and base state's head frame. 70 feet tall, 7,900 pounds, or 79,000 pounds, set up for skip dumping. And a little footnote in this book of Milo Smith Ketchum's Design of Mine Structure said, with the exception of the Ground Central, which was in Utah somewhere, all of these head frames were erected in the Butte district. Basin's not part of the Butte district. So that kind of led me to think, well, maybe there's something going on here. So I started looking. So the side bracing matches the designs, and then I did an overlay of a line drawing of the original engineering drawings, and it basically matches. So I'm thinking that the Orphan Girls actually order number 561 that was designed in 1899 by Gillette Herzog for the Basin and Bay State Company. I think that the Glass brothers were talked out of their original overly heavy design, and they ordered this one. It was probably for the Hope Shaft, because most of the Basin and Bay State Company, they built the smelter. Gillette Herzog did the structural steel for the smelter and basin. But most of the mines of this company were basically tunnel developed. Only the Hope mine had a 600-foot shaft. However, then I found out what happened. In 1900, the Glass brothers lost control to a hostile takeover led by our friend again, Fritz Augustus. He wanted the concentrator so he could treat his ore, because there was a water shortage in Butte. So he basically diddled the poor Glass brothers out of all their stuff, and we know that no mining really ever happened basically from that time on. But all the Davis Daily ore eventually went to the concentrator up there, and a lot of other ore from the MOP went to the Basin smelter, or the Basin concentrator. Supposedly he tried to use the Basin smelter and did a test lot of ore, but there's very little evidence that it was ever used. If it was used at all, it was only tested. Now eventually a flotation concentrator was installed in the mill up there in Basin, but that's probably what happened, is that they ordered this head frame, it was designed and was stored in Basin, waiting erection, and when Fritz Augustus wanted to steal something, he's like, well, I got this sitting around and it doesn't cost me anything, so I'll just stick it up and we'll put it down here. The funny thing is that almost all the designers and mining engineers at the time did not want to have anything to do with him. J.M. Callow, who was head of general engineering in Salt Lake City, he built part of the plant in Anaconda and also part of the plant out in Great Falls, and Miami Copper in Arizona. He only alluded to the fact that when he was doing his flotation research in the early part of the 20th century, that he telegraphed to the Davis Daily Company for a porous brick. He didn't mention that he was employed as a mining engineer here at the Colorado for Davis Daily. Other folks seem to just not to want to distance themselves from anything. So whether this was actually ordered by Davis Daily, which is very doubtful because of the design, the date on the design, or whether it's just that nobody wanted to admit that they did anything for Fritz Augustus, it's hard to say. That's one of those things where so far back from that point, is it makes you wonder. But that's what I think is fascinating. Is I'm willing to bet you money that this is the same head frame that was built for the Basin and Bay State, because everything matches. The weight on it, 4 or 5 different publications have the same weights. The height is right, and there's no other unaccounted for head frames in the area. And there's no evidence of anything being built in Basin that wasn't wooden. So preservation. Once again, guys, some of them don't have maintenance on them. Private. You know, those that are in private ownership still, you can't do much on that. Looting is a big problem. Last year I ran into Randy Merkich taking a walk up on the hill, and he was saying how he was always seeing people trying to break in. I know you guys have seen in the paper where the police have caught folks trying to break in. The Mount Con hoist had part of the motor stolen by people looking to recycle. That's a big problem is if there's things laying around that people think they can get away with, they'll raid them. Vandalism. Last year when I was back for Christmas, somebody was trying to steal cable out of one of the access points up the mountain and Consolidated, and it was on fire. And it burned the entire time I was back last year. Every day when I would be in town, I'd see the city fire truck up there pouring water down the hole again. And that's something that you really can't stop unless you can change the whole attitude that folks are feeling. Not as something that, this is something I can make money out of, this is something that I need to, that'll help my memory. And we can't stop people that privately own things from selling them. Now, of the other ones, we have a couple of seriously endangered head frames here in Butte. The Parrot, which was erected after 1915, has had basically no maintenance on it. It's a protect and avoid one. But if it's not getting some maintenance, at some point it's gonna fall over. The wood's going to rot, and it's going to just basically disintegrate. Those of you that ever went into the mountains around Phillipsburg, the Algonquin head frame was still standing in the late 1980s, and it's just a pile of rotted wood right now. And it worked into the 1950s. So once again, with wooden head frames, there has to be constant maintenance of some sort on it, whether it's painting or preservative added. The other one's a pilot butte. That's in a remote location and escapes a lot of folks' notice. And it's only a maintenance head frame, but it still was put up for a purpose and helps tell the story of the entire mining landscape. And another one, this is one that some of you guys may not know about. This is up on Frog Pond Road up north of Walkerville, on Gregory No. 5 shaft. It's another forgotten head frame. I don't know who owns it because the land ownership is, there's so many overlaying claims there, it's really hard to get a straight name over who owns what. But this is another one, it's starting to lean. It's a little two-post head frame that's basically set up for bucket hoisting, but if it's public ground, this would be another one that ought to be preserved because this shows the small mine development class head frame Butte, whereas everything else is heavy production. But once again, where does the money come from? In all preservation systems, where does the money come from? So I've gone a little bit longer than I intended, but some of the other things that we lost. The atomic head frame was bulldozed and hauled to the county landfill in reclamation work in the 1980s. The jewel head frame, these are all west between Butte and Rocker, had collapsed by the mid-1990s. There's at least one other head frame southwest of Asme on Forest Service land. Silver Star has one Butte head frame standing in the collection out there, and there may be another one in the yard. I've heard rumors, but I'm not sure. Somebody in the Mining History Association said they thought there was another one stored in the yard out there, along with, I believe it's the West Grey Rock that he's got set up. And then, of course, the only Montana head frames are in Eureka, Utah, and one of them is in the process of collapsing. So anyway, so a lot of folks, I've drawn a lot of these photographs, the old photographs were drawn from publications of the time period. I tried to go back and get original documentation, and that's been a change over the last few years. Whereas once you only had the choice of actually physically accessing the documents, so many libraries have digitized their collections, you can get the textbooks and engineering drawings. Now to give you an idea of how important this is, you guys saw engineering drawings of American Bridge and Gillette Herzog. American Bridge doesn't have any of those. All they have are 3x5 order cards. That's all I've been on, yeah, that's all they have, 3x5 order cards from that time period. I talked to their archivist and company historian, and they're like, we have no drawings of anything, just the order cards. So in the last few years, the digitization has allowed these things to become accessible at any, you don't have to wait for an interlibrary loan, they'll scan them and send them to you, and then you've got it as long as you like. And that's where I'm going to do some absolute ground nosing. It's absolutely important we continue to support efforts like the Butte Archives and archives in other counties, and history, like, history associations, so that this stuff is available, so that when somebody has a question, they don't have to, gee, I wonder. They can see, it should be as easy as a Wikipedia lookup so that you get the right information. And as, James Burke, he was a BBC presenter, said that the universe is only only as we understand it. What we know is how the universe actually works is how the universe works. When our knowledge of how the universe works changes, therefore the universe changes. And that's really the truth with all knowledge. The knowledge is correct up until the point that your understanding of it changes. And when that changes, then the knowledge changes, and it's best to pass it on. And if knowledge never changes and never evolves, then it's dead. And we always have to add on to this. So here's one thing I want to do is, you've heard me say some critical items about Mr. Twitty's book that he wrote in 2002. Everything we know is built upon what somebody did before us. We have to continue building on to that. And I've seen that in Butte. I've been away for 10 years, but I come back and I see all the festivals and all the wonderful things that are going on here. And that's something that's very important, is the head frames are a symbol. The original cultural reuse is important. The original is now a stage, it's not a mine. It's going to become a symbol of its own that's completely separate from the mine symbol in a number of years, because we're going to remember what it's become. As we continue to use things and we continue to evolve their use, that's important. And that's what keeps history alive and keeps our memories alive. So I will shut up and let you guys go. Thank you very much.